The tiny settlement of Lonely Canyon, lost in the harsh foothills of the Rocky Mountains, lived by its own wild laws. Here, people valued endurance and silence, and words, if they were spoken, were as sharp as knives. It was in this world, where survival was a daily battle, that the personal tragedy of 16-year-old Lillian White unfolded. Her life, once filled with dreams of books and distant cities, had now turned into a bitter reality. Her father, Jack White, once a strong and sensible miner, was broken by a string of failures in the mine and a penchant for saloon cards. Debts grew like weeds after the rain, and a threat loomed over their humble home. The last, desperate step to save his own life and pay off his debt to the ruthless loan shark, Archie Black, was an exchange that crushed Lillian. She was being sold, not for gold or land, but for the forgiveness of a debt and a promise of immunity. Her beer was Silas Crawford, a man who lived high in the mountains. Dark legends were told about him. They said he was unsociable, his gaze was cold, and his hands, accustomed to the axe and the rifle, knew no mercy. For Lillian, this wasn't just a marriage of convenience, it was a humiliating exile, a shameful bargain that turned her into an object. Her fragile body trembled with indignation and a deep hatred for her father, who had so easily given her up. She clutched a faded scrap of cloth, the only gift from her deceased mother that she had taken with her. On the day the transfer was to take place, everything in Lonely Canyon seemed to freeze. The town's residents, usually busy with their affairs, came out onto the single dusty street to gawk. Their curious glances, full of judgment and hidden malice, pierced Lillian like ice needles. She stood by her house, dressed in her only decent dress, a simple, gray one, but neatly mended. Her dark chestnut hair, braided into a tight plait, was dusted with road dust. On her face, despite her young age, deep suffering was visible, and her eyes, usually lively and expressive, were now extinguished, like two dark abysses. She felt dirty, abandoned, betrayed. Jack White, her father, stood beside her. His once strong shoulders were now stooped, and his gaze wandered, avoiding his daughter. He was broken, and his decision, however desperate it was, seemed to Lillian like the highest form of cowardice. He saw in her only a means of survival, not a beloved daughter. And then Silas Crawford appeared. He descended from the mountains, his silhouette outlined against the bright orange sunset. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the effortless grace of a predator. He wore a worn-out fur jacket, thick leather pants, and old, well-worn boots. His face, weathered and covered with a thick dark beard, seemed to be carved from stone. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were cold and penetrating. They swept over the crowd, lingering for just a moment on Lillian, and then moving on to her father. An old axe hung carelessly in his hand, a tool, not a weapon, but in his presence it seemed menacing. Not a drop of warmth or sympathy could be read in this man, only a wild, primal strength. Silas's voice was low, deep, like the rumble of stones in a mountain gorge. Jack, I've come for what's mine. Jack, his voice trembled. Silas, she's yours. She be a good wife. Lillian felt her stomach churn. A good wife, those words sounded like a sentence. She looked at her father with hatred, then shifted her gaze to Silas. In his eyes there was neither lust nor wicked joy, only cold, detached resolve, which frightened her more than anything else. He saw in her only part of a deal, an object he was taking. Silas nodded at Jack, took a scroll of documents from his hands, confirming the transfer, then turned to Lillian. Silas briefly, without emotion, lets go. He walked up to his mule, which was burdened with a minimal pack, and got into the saddle. Lillian, like a ghostly shadow, followed him. She did not say goodbye to her father, did not look back at the house where her short and unhappy life had passed. All bridges were burned. Their path into the mountains was long and silent. Lillian rode on a second, equally exhausted mule, her body aching from the tension, and her soul from resentment. She didn't dare to look up at Silas. His silence was heavier than any cry. She felt him looking at her, but she couldn't understand what was hidden behind that impenetrable gaze. Every mile of the journey took her further from a world of people and plunged her into a wild, unpredictable wilderness where she felt completely helpless. When night fell on the mountains, Silas stopped at a small crevice in the rock. He quickly made a fire, and the flames cast bizarre shadows on his rugged face. He handed her a piece of dried meat and a hard, bland bread. Silas briefly ate. Lillian couldn't bring herself to eat. She sat curled up in a ball and looked at the fire, trying to suppress her nausea. The disgust for her new life, for this man, for everything that had happened to her overwhelmed her. Silas's voice was even, without a hint of emotion. "You're not my wife. You're my ward. Your father asked me to protect you from Archie Black. He wanted to take you by force." Lillian shuddered. Silas's words were like a bolt of lightning. Did her father really do this to save her? Or was it just another lie? She couldn't believe it. Her heart was breaking from pain and confusion. That if he was telling the truth, that meant her father, however weak he was not a complete monster. And Silas was not an executioner, but a savior. This thought turned her world upside down. The hatred for him began to slowly change to intrigue. Who was this man really? And what really happened? Silas Crawford's house was not what Lillian had expected. She had imagined a dark, dirty den, but what she saw amazed her with its cleanliness and order. The log cabin, clinging to the sheer rock face, was small, but inside reigned perfect order. The floors were carefully swept, the kitchen utensils were shined to a gleam and neatly hung on the wall. Even the air here was different. It smelled of pine resin, fresh wood, and something subtly homey. This didn't fit at all with the image of the unsociable savage I had painted for her in town. She felt lost, cornered, but for the first time in many days, she felt a little calmer. Silas, without saying a word, took a cast iron pot with stewed meat and corn porridge from the stove, which smelled incredibly delicious. He silently placed a plate in front of her. "Eat." His voice was as brief as it had been last night, but in his tone there was no longer the same detachment. He was the master of the house, and his words were simple instructions, not commands. Lillian ate everything he put on her plate. The hot food and the feeling of safety were a new, unexpected experience for her. Finally, she could feel that her body belonged to her, and was not an object of a bargain. The next morning began the long, silent days of their life together. Lillian watched Silas like a new, strange species of wild animal, trying to understand his rules. He got up at dawn and immediately set to work. His movements were precise and economical. He chopped firewood, his axe ringing as if it were an extension of his arm, and each log fell evenly, without unnecessary movements. He fixed the fence. His hands, despite their roughness, worked deftly with wood and a hammer. She noticed how he talked to his old, blind dog, named Patch. He spoke to her softly, almost in a whisper. This was the first sign of his gentleness that Lillian had seen. He was patient and caring with her, as if she were his only friend. Lillian, trying to find something to do, began to help around the house. She cleaned, she washed, she cooked. She didn't ask for permission, she just did it. One day she decided to help him with the garden, which was laid out at the foot of the rock face. She was not good at farming. Awkwardly taking a shovel in her hands, she tried to dig the earth, but nothing worked out. She pressed on the tool with all her strength, and her hands were already starting to hurt. Silas, who had been watching her from a distance, came over. He said nothing. He simply came over, took the shovel from her hands and showed her how to do it correctly. Silas's voice was calm and even. "Look, don't push. You need to feel the earth, and then it will give itself to you. It will accept you." He showed her how to hold the tool correctly, how to press on it so that it would easily sink into the ground. He moved slowly, but with incredible power, and the shovel, it seemed, entered the soil on its own. Lillian looked at him with surprise. At that moment she saw not a rough savage, but a skillful master who knew and understood his land, his work, and his words. "It will accept you." There was something deep in them that touched her to the core. From that time on, a strange, silent connection was established between them. Lillian stopped being afraid of him, and instead began to watch him with interest. She saw that behind his stern exterior was incredible strength and kindness that he never spoke of. She began to understand that his silence was not contempt, but a way of protecting himself from a world that had hurt him so much. She began to feel that he was like her. They were both outcasts, both broken by life. One day, when Silas was working in the distant woods, Lillian was sorting through his trunk, trying to find something that could be mended. There was nothing there but his work clothes and an old, tattered blanket. But at the very bottom she came across a small wooden box. Her hands trembled with excitement. Opening it, she saw several old letters tied with a thin blue ribbon, and an old, faded photograph. In it was a young woman with a kind face, holding a small, laughing girl in her arms. And next to them, stood a young, beardless Silas. In his eyes then, there was not yet that cold emptiness. His eyes glowed. Lillian gazed at the photograph. Who were these people? What happened to them? And why does Silas carry them with him? She felt her heart clench with pain and compassion. She understood that this man had a secret that burdened him. And this secret, whatever it was, explained his silence and his detachment. She put the box away and went to the window. In the distance she saw Silas returning from a hunt. He was walking slowly, his shoulders were hunched, but his head was held high. And at that moment, looking at him, she understood that behind his silence was not just strength, but also a deep, unbearable pain that forced him to live in solitude. She felt that she needed to know what had happened to him. And at that moment, she felt that her attitude towards him had completely changed. Hatred was replaced by intrigue, and intrigue by something more, by something she couldn't understand, but which no longer left her heart indifferent. The months spent in the mountains erased the imprint of city bustle and dull hopelessness from Lillian. She no longer felt like an object, abandoned to her fate. She had managed to find new meaning in a routine that once seemed like a prison. Each day was filled with quiet but meaningful work. She learned to bake sourdough bread, to mend Silas's clothes, and he, in turn, began to open his world to her. Without saying a word, he showed her where the best berries grew in the mountains, how to distinguish healing herbs from poisonous ones, how to catch fish in the mountain river without making a sound. A deep, nonverbal understanding grew between them, based on respect and trust. Lillian began to notice glimmers of warmth in Silas's eyes that had previously been hidden under a layer of icy indifference. She was no longer just trying to understand him. She wanted to protect the secret she felt in his heart. Her former hatred for him was replaced by a deep, all-consuming attraction. One afternoon, when Lillian was washing dishes and Silas was checking his traps, two horsemen rode up to their house. From their walk, sharp and nervous, Lillian immediately knew these were not just travelers. One of them had a familiar, repulsive silhouette. It was Archie Black. His face was red with anger, and his eyes burned like two coals. Next to him was his loyal henchman, a tall, lanky man whom Lillian didn't know. Archie Black, his voice was raspy and filled with malice. Crawford, I've come for what's mine. I know she's here. Silas, who was just coming out of the barn, froze. In his gaze, which had just been calm, a rage that Lillian had never seen before flared up. His hands clenched into fists, and his face, usually so impassive, contorted into a grimace of anger. He stepped forward, out into the open. Silas, his voice was quiet, but it held such a threat that a chill ran down Lillian's spine. You shouldn't have come here, Archie. Archie Black, he laughed, and his laugh made Lillian's knees buckle. Oh yeah, you're not glad to see me. You took what was mine. I came for what belongs to me by right. And you're just a pawn. His words, it seemed, did not faze Silas, but when he shifted his gaze to Lillian, who was standing by the door, his eyes filled with cold, and his face became like stone. Silas, his voice was full of hatred. You came here to get from me what you couldn't get, and I'll give it to you. But first you'll pay for what you did to Mary Ann, little Elizabeth. Lillian shuddered. Mary. Elizabeth. She remembered the photograph from the box. The woman and the girl. Were they his wife and daughter? And were they killed by this man? At that moment, she experienced a shock that was stronger than anything she had ever lived through. Archie Black, upon hearing the names, turned pale, his face contorted with horror and fury. He pulled out his revolver and fired. Silas, moving with incredible speed, managed to dodge it. A bullet whistled past his head and embedded itself in the wall. Silas, like a furious bear, lunged at him. He knocked him to the ground, and the fight began. Lillian, seized with horror, watched what was happening. She saw how Silas, who had always seemed so calm and composed, had turned into a raging beast. He beat Archie like a man possessed, ignoring his resistance. Finally, he threw him aside. Archie was beaten and broken, his face covered in blood. He lay on the ground, unable to move. Silas's voice was hoarse, full of hatred. You've paid for what you did. Now go, and if I ever see you again, I'll kill you. Archie, having difficulty getting up, grabbed his henchman, who had stood to the side all this time, and they hurriedly rode away. Lillian, unable to hold back her emotions, ran up to Silas. There were scrapes on his face, and a deep cut on his hand. He was sitting on the ground, his head was bowed, and his eyes were full of the unbearable pain that Lillian had seen only in his eyes in the photograph. Lillian, her voice trembled. Silas, what happened? He raised his eyes to her. In them was such deep pain that tears came to Lillian's eyes. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, and in his gaze she saw his entire story. The story of a man who lost everything that was dear to him. He lost his wife, his daughter, his family. He was forced to go into the mountains to escape the pain and live with it in solitude. He was broken, but he was not defeated, and she understood that she had the strength to help him. She brought him water to clean his wounds and sat down next to him. She took his hand, gently wiped the wound and bandaged it. She didn't say a word. She just stayed by his side. She felt how his hand, which was always so strong, was now trembling, and at that moment she understood that behind his rough, unapproachable exterior hides a wounded soul that needs love and compassion. She no longer feared him, no longer hated him, no longer despised him. She simply loved him, and this love was pure and selfless. The weeks following the attack became a new beginning for Lillian and Silas. The wounds on his face were healing, but the scars left on his heart were just beginning to close. She was no longer a helpless girl, given away for death. She was now a woman who knew the price of courage and compassion. And he was no longer a reclusive, lonely savage, but a man who had found the strength to go on living. The mutual understanding between them was no longer just a silent respect, but a deep, complete trust. They had both experienced betrayal and pain, and the shared wound now connected them more strongly than any words. One evening, sitting by the fire, Silas spoke for the first time. He talked for a long time. His voice was hoarse, and the words were difficult, but Lillian listened without interrupting. He told her about his wife Mary, about her laughter and kindness, about little Elizabeth who loved to draw flowers and stars in the sand. He told her how Archie Black, who had been his friend, had envied his happiness. He set up an attack on his home to take his land and everything he owned. He killed them both, leaving him alone with a broken heart. Silas couldn't find the strength to take revenge. His pain was so great that he simply went into the mountains to hide from the world. Silas's voice was full of despair. I thought I was alone in this world, that no one needed me, that I could never be happy again. I couldn't find the strength in myself to go on living, and I left. Lillian, listening to him, could not hold back her tears. She reached out and gently touched his hand. He did not pull away. He took her hand and squeezed it tightly. For the first time in many years, he felt that he was not alone, that there was someone who understood and loved him. Lillian, her voice was gentle and full of love. You're not alone, Silas. I'm here, and I will never leave you. In her eyes he saw not pity, but a purer, sincere love, the kind he had once lost. He saw in her not just a girl he had saved, but a woman who had saved him. He understood that she was his second chance, a chance for a new life, for a new family, for new happiness. He stood up, walked over to her, and hugged her. And at that moment he felt that his wound, which had been hurting for so long, was beginning to close. That night they talked until dawn. He told her everything that was on his soul. She told him about her dreams, about her fears, about her hope for a better future. They were two broken souls who found solace in each other. Silas, he looked at her. You're my hope, Lillian, my light at the end of the tunnel. I don't want to live alone anymore. Will you be my wife? Lillian nodded. Tears of joy ran down her cheeks. She couldn't believe that her life, which had seemed so hopeless, had changed so miraculously. She was confident in her choice, and she knew that with this man she would be safe, she would be loved. A few weeks later they quietly got married, exchanging rings made from old silver spoons that Silas had made himself. They didn't need a priest or witnesses. Their union was blessed by the mountains, the forests, and the stars that had witnessed their love. Lillian and Silas became one family, creating their own small but strong world in the heart of the wild mountains. The lesson of the story of Lillian and Silas, is not just a tale of love in the Wild West. It's a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, you can find light. Lillian was humiliated and abandoned, but instead of breaking, she found the strength to open her heart to a stranger. Silas, in turn, endured unbearable loss, but allowed another's kindness to reawaken in him the desire to live. This story teaches us that kindness and compassion are not a weakness, but the greatest strength. They are able to heal even the deepest wounds. Our grandparents, who have lived through many hardships, know that life is not always easy. But this story reminds us that it's never too late to find solace and new meaning. Perhaps today, you live in a different world, where there are no wild prairies, but there are still people who feel lost and lonely. It is important to lend them a helping hand, to talk, to show compassion, for that is what true humanity is all about. This story shows that even in the most impossible situations you can find peace and happiness, and that true love is not just strong feelings, but a quiet, daily care that over time becomes the foundation on which to build a new, happy life.